Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to give people a couple of minutes to join, and then we'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. I can see that the numbers are going up, so we'll start with the housekeeping, and then we'll go into the presentation. So please feel free to ask any questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A function that you might be able to see either at the top or the bottom of your screen. And we'll go to the Q&A at the end of the session. Also, today's session is being recorded, so we'll send the recording to everyone who registered after the session, along with some other resources. So I think we're ready to start. So let me say welcome again to today's webinar about fact-checking sources. We're going to start with some introductions. I'm Maria, and I am a Senior Marketing Manager for Sage Campus. And joining me today is our very special guest, Sarah Morris. Sarah is a librarian, educator, and curriculum designer whose work focuses on critical information and media literacy, misinformation, civic engagement, student success, and library and information science education. She has held positions at Loyola University Chicago, the University of Texas, and served as the head of instruction and engagement at the Emory University Libraries. Sarah has worked on curriculum projects with partners that include the Mozilla Foundation and the Carter Center. She currently works as an instructional designer and consultant and is pursuing her PhD in communication and information science from University of Alabama. For those of you who might not know us very well, Sage Campus is a library resource created by Sage, offering a suite of online courses covering key skills and research methods across all stages of academic study. Our courses are developed by experts with fantastic instructors such as our guest speaker today, Sarah. I think we are now ready to start, so I'm going to hand it over to you, Sarah, to share your slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maria. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Let me get my slides pulled up really quick. And I will apologize in advance for if I start sneezing or coughing. Allergy season has hit me hard this year. So I'm armed with water. So I think we're good to go. So, all right, Maria, is that showing up okay?
Yeah, all
All
good.
right, fantastic. All right. So I'm going to dive into our content today. Really excited to be talking about this topic with you all. And as Maria said, please feel free to include things in the Q&A. I have that pulled up here and can see it okay. And we will definitely leave a lot of time at the end for any questions you might have. Would love to hear from all of you. And if we have something that comes up in the middle, I can pause and take a question then as well. So, all right. Let's get started. So today, what I'd love to focus on are a few different things. So after the session, my goal is that you'll learn about some different strategies that you can use to investigate and evaluate sources. And we're going to sort of break down what we mean by those terms and what that all entails. We'll kind of look at when and where different fact-checking techniques or investigation techniques could potentially be most appropriate. And we'll close out with some ways to just further develop and continue practicing fact-checking skills. So whether you're here to develop these skills yourself, or perhaps you're an educator or librarian who teaches others about these skills, I hope this will be some interesting information, and excited to hear your questions and thoughts as well, because I think this is an important topic right now and a lot of changes with technology, particularly AI, that is sort of impacting the space as well. So just to kind of kick things off, and you can just sort of think on this and keep it in mind as we're going along, but if you're, say, conducting a research project or teaching others about how to conduct research, it obviously has a lot of different steps to it. So just sort of for your own reflection, consider what is some of the most challenging aspects of that for you? Are there parts that are more time consuming than others? And I bring this up because when we're talking about kind of the research process, there's many different steps, from selecting a topic and refining it to actually finding sources you need to finally getting to the finish line and sharing things with others. But a key kind of component or steps in the middle often involves evaluating the sources. So figuring out what's going to be the best source to use for your particular project need, making sure your sources are credible so you can share them with others, selecting the best ones to use for whatever you're trying to accomplish. So there's definitely a lot of sort of steps in this process that end up revolving around evaluating content, fact checking content for a couple of different reasons. So we're going to break this down together today. All right. So to begin with, what on earth are we talking about when we say fact checking? So this term could also involve, I already mentioned a few alternatives such as source evaluation, investigating sources, however you want to frame it. But in a nutshell, what we're talking about is an ability to find and identify appropriate sources for an information need, as well as evaluating and checking sources to determine if they're accurate. And a lot of times, I think when you hear fact checking, you can sort of just gravitate towards we're checking it for whether it's factual, whether it's credible. And that's a huge component of this. But I also think it's important to consider that first step of making sure you're finding appropriate sources for a need and connecting this in with broader source evaluation skills. The last thing that you can consider when you're checking sources, evaluating them, is thinking about how you might want to use sort of different sources for a project or a particular research need. As I'm sure many of you know, not all research needs or projects are created equal. Sometimes one source might be a really appropriate fit and the best thing. And other times, if your audience has changed, your deliverables change, it really just might not make that much sense anymore. So for whether you're considering this for yourself or working with students, there can be a lot of different components and questions to consider about finding and using different sorts of sources and making sure you're finding information that is factual and credible and isn't, misleading or incorrect in some shape or form. So we're going to break down these three components together today. So I did want to just flag why fact checking skills matter. And I kind of brainstormed this out just for this webinar and really kind of thinking about why am I so interested in this and why am I passionate about this topic? I would love to hear from all of you too, if you have other components here that you feel are important to flag. But just to break this down together, I think being able to check on sources, evaluate sources, fact check sources is important for a couple of different reasons. So one is that we all inhabit increasingly complex information ecosystems, information environments, however you want to turn it or term it. We have social media sites, you have search engines where you can find things, you have databases at libraries, traditional news outlets. There's a lot of different spaces you can go to get information and to navigate how all these different platforms and environments might present information, how you might share information on them. And this can lead to information overload, which is a term many of you are probably quite familiar with. But essentially, what we're talking about is the fact that, particularly thanks to the internet, we have access to so much information. It can get really overwhelming and can get tricky sometimes to sort of sift through everything that's out there. Part of that challenge, too, is that we're constantly being exposed to sources of, to put it mildly, varying degrees of quality and credibility. So there's a lot of gossip and rumor and just sort of junk content, as it were, out there, misleading content, scams, as well as really high caliber and well-researched things. And having to sift through all of that, being exposed to so much all the time, it can make it really challenging to determine, what's the best source out there for your need or what's going to be the most credible piece of information that you can find. Another aspect that I think makes fact checking increasingly important nowadays is that it can be hard to tell what things are online sometimes. And by that, I mean, if you think about, say, a Facebook post or something on Instagram, things tend to look sort of the same on different social media platforms. Um, but it can sometimes sort of obscure maybe where the information came from in the first place, or what exactly, type of article is being shared here. What exactly are you looking at? That can, I think, just add to the difficulty and, selecting sources and determining what's credible or not, and can pose real challenges for people. Of course, the rise in both mis and disinformation online, and just to kind of define those terms briefly, misinformation generally means either not factual, misleading, not credible content that's being shared through various means. Disinformation is similar, but it's often refers to misleading content that is deliberately being shared with people in order to fool them, to trick them, to the goal could be to make money, to scam people. There can be a lot of different things that go into that, but that's certainly a component of our information ecosystems and just adds to the challenge of sifting through content, finding what's credible. So in a nutshell, I would definitely say fact-checking skills are increasingly important, not just for research, but for information literacy skills and kind of just a general life skill at this point as well. So a great thing to practice on your own or to be able to impart to students you might be working with and just help empower them to navigate these complex systems. Okay. So there are definite challenges to fact checking, however. So in some respects, I think checking sources, evaluating sources, etc., can be both more and less complex than you'd think. One sort of difficulty is there's not really one size fits all solution for everything or some sort of neat shortcut for fact checking, which I know is sort of sad to hear. I get asked this often. It's like, okay, well, how can I do this quickly? Or how can I know for sure? Unfortunately, there's not some magic way to necessarily do this, and different situations can involve different needs as well, which we'll talk about in a second. But the good news is that fact checking, I think a lot of times involves questions that you can ask in a lot of different situations. Like checking on who the author is can just be a great standard practice. And these are skills you can practice and refine as well. So again, it's both more and less complex than sometimes you think it would be. And in many respects, it boils down to just critical thinking skills and just asking questions and kind of taking a pause and reflecting about what you're seeing. Some other challenges that come up is that fact checking doesn't happen in a vacuum. So there's a couple of things I like to emphasize that can be important to consider as people are engaging in fact checking or practicing it or developing that skill set. So, one thing is that project and information needs definitely play a role. So, if you have sort of a low stakes need versus maybe a critical decision or a major project you're working on, the techniques you use might look the same. You might still check on like who on earth wrote this or what kind of source am I looking at or where did I find this? Is it a reputable space? But the time and energy and sort of the amount of depth you go into could change. So one example I thought of was a low stakes need, for instance, could be you're trying to find a restaurant to eat at. Maybe you want to go someplace new. So you're going to check like reviews or, look up information about the restaurant. So maybe you found some, I don't know, the restaurant paid some people to leave positive reviews and they turned out to be misleading and then it's not actually that great. That's a bummer. You didn't get a good dinner, but perhaps not the end of the world. Versus maybe you're trying to make a really critical health decision or you're deciding whether to start a new, fitness program or something, or make a decision about a major purchase you need to make, or a big research paper that's 50% of your grade you have to turn in. That might be a situation where you're going to want to spend some extra time like really checking those sources and making sure you're absolutely not finding something that isn't factual, isn't credible, because you could actually say get injured if you do a workout that isn't appropriate, or fail your paper if you're turning in bogus sources. So that kind of situation can be important to consider. The role of sort of the individual as well can play a part here. And by that, I mean, we as humans all have personal biases. We have areas that we know more about. We have prior knowledge. And so sometimes if you're in a situation where you're needing to check on sources to see, what's credible, what's not, if you know a lot more about the situation, that can sometimes make it easier to fact check because you'll maybe see things or see red flags or know, oh, I've read this author before. They're great. I trust their stuff. I can go from there versus a situation where you maybe don't know much about it. An example I thought of here is, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially in the early days, I joked everyone became an amateur epidemiologist overnight, and we were all trying to figure stuff out. It was very stressful, very trying time, but you can see where it's really complicated information. Is stuff that maybe many of us probably had no prior exposure to. I personally didn't know anything about, infectious diseases, et cetera. So you're trying to keep up with all the information that's churning, and that can be a situation where even just recognizing that I was a history major, I don't know much about biology, I probably should exercise a little more caution when I'm kind of coming across stuff because I just wouldn't know the difference either way. And finally, different situations can just be good to kind of keep an eye on. So if you're researching, for example, a really contentious topic or issue, those can often be breeding grounds for, say, misleading information or rumors or conspiracy theories to really take off just because of the nature of the topic. You can start having rumors and things flying around. So if you already know you're kind of looking into a situation like that, that can also be a situation where it can be good to, okay, maybe I need to spend a little more time checking on this information. I shouldn't jump to conclusions here. Let me try to get a better sense of what different people or different voices are saying around an issue, which is something I talk about with student researchers who I work with who often want to delve into, critical topics and issues, which is fantastic, but, go into it with some awareness that you're going to need to sift through different conversations and maybe double check those sources. So again, doesn't all happen in a vacuum. All right. So in terms of developing these different skills for different situations, there's a couple of things that I think you can do and highlight and work with others on. So one is just learning different sort of key questions to ask. So I already mentioned, checking on authors. That's like a standard, who on earth is talking about this? What are their credentials? Are they even trustworthy? There's, I think, certain key questions you can just get into the habit of asking when you're encountering different kinds of sources and information that can just build that kind of critical thinking muscle, as it were, and get you in the habit of just, approaching things with curiosity, with healthy skepticism and ability to kind of ask and investigate. There's also different tools and techniques you can use. So we'll touch upon this as well, but particularly I've, talked with a lot of people who have concerns lately about, images and fake images and videos and things like that, and things you might not be able to just detect by looking at it. But there are things like reverse image searching or different kinds of tools and resources we'll touch upon more at the end that you can sort of deploy to help you check on things. And finally, back to the previous slide, recognizing situations when fact checking might be required or more in-depth fact checking might be sort of necessary, whether it's a high stakes situation, a really complex topic, and things like that. And I think that can sometimes help people, maybe ideally feel more equipped and empowered around it because fact checking, it can take some time, occasionally. And I think people often, I certainly do too, want just like, you want a shortcut, you want something that can be fast to do. But, certain situations, knowing that, yeah, this is a space where I need to spend a little more time with this, I think can be impactful. All right. So I wanted to touch briefly upon finding both credible and appropriate sources for a need. And I'm going to start with this one because, again, this to me is a component of evaluating sources and fact checking that maybe isn't, again, when you think of fact checking, you often think of credibility and, making sure it's factual, which is obviously a huge component. But I like to sort of weave this in because just having that awareness of the situation you're in or what your needs might be can again help you make decisions about the techniques you want to use, questions you might be asking, and things like that. So just real briefly here, obviously different sources can be used for different needs, and sources can play roles in lots of different scenarios and situations. So you might have different information needs. We already touched upon this some, but maybe you're trying to make an informed decision. Maybe you're trying to find answers to a question or engage in a debate. And you could also have project-based needs. So maybe you're engaging in a scholarly conversation and need to delve into that literature, or you want to share work with others and make sure it is, factual and informed and everything there. This is something for any librarians on the call or educators. You probably talked about this with students before, but unfortunately, there's not really a perfect or ideal source always. I think people always want to find the best source and make sure it's the best, but you're often cobbling together a lot of different things and different conversations. And ultimately, you just want to find the right source or sources for your specific information need and, what kind of project it is you are working on. So different projects can obviously have a lot of different needs. Your audience can vary. One example I've used before, just talking with students in terms of thinking about how you go about finding sources and using them and checking them, is if you are working on a project that's aimed at children, say fifth grade students. You're probably not going to want to hop into JSTOR and find a bunch of scholarly literature on the topic and then share that with 10-year-olds, because that isn't going to land or make much sense with them. So you might need different kinds of materials or really think about different ways of presenting that, versus maybe you're going to an academic conference, and if you rock up and they're sharing the Wikipedia article you read and some other stuff, you might get booed or laughed out of the room. That wouldn't be appropriate for that venue. They're expecting you to, refer back to the scholarship. So things like that can again change what it is you're trying to find, and then how you might go about checking that particular source. Scholarly sources obviously have things like peer review or various rigorous aspects to them, whereas something you found on the internet, you might need to kind of ask slightly different questions or look at some different features or components just to make sure you understand what you're seeing, what you're using, and if it's sort of appropriate. Um, Carrying on with some other things here, you could have different questions you're asking or goals. Deliverables can come into play here too. Just thinking about students I've worked with, aside from traditional research papers, I've worked with students who are doing a podcast or a website, for example. And again, the types of sources they might want to find and engage with can start looking pretty different. I've also worked with students, and I do this myself. I research myths and disinformation. So sometimes the source I'm finding is actually is a conspiracy theory. And so under normal circumstances, you'd think that isn't a credible source, but it actually is appropriate for my research need because I need it as evidence for something. So sometimes that can trip people up too. Project requirements, I talk with students sometimes, their professor might want them to use specific kinds of things, and just sort of knowing where conversations are happening. All of these things can come into play and lead people to find different kinds of sources or need to engage with different things. And just having an understanding of what some key differences are, what things are, can help them better ask questions and make sure they're kind of checking on them appropriately and finding the best source for their particular need. So in terms of actually selecting appropriate sources and going about checking them, there's a couple of things that come into play here. So knowing sort of where to look for things is often key. Especially for any librarians here, we often have to instruct students on, how to go about finding scholarly sources, for example, and what you use to do that, if that's something you actually need, and then knowing what the key components are, so how you can check and make sure, yep, this is what I thought it was going to be. This is correct. This is what I need. Knowing what to look for as well. Again, there's so many types of sources you can use out there. They can be created in different ways. They can be found in different places. So even just having some of that knowledge, armed at the ready, can improve your ability to find appropriate things and then check it accordingly. Of course, how to check your sources. So what questions you might want to be asking. Some of them are common because we're consistently across everything. I always say, asking what the purpose of something is or who the author is. Very standard questions that we probably often naturally ask anyway are important. But there could also be things that might shift a little depending on what the exact source is. For instance, if somebody's working with something maybe they found on social media, you might need to ask both who posted it, but also where it actually came from originally. So you're kind of doing kind of almost a two-pronged set of questions there, just to make sure you have a full picture of, all right, someone shared this article. Why did they do that? But also, what does the original article say and who wrote it? So you're asking maybe some extra questions there. And finally, just knowing your project goals and whether the sources are going to fit in with your needs. So I wanted to highlight all of that because I think in terms of fact checking and evaluating sources for different projects, for research, et cetera, it can be helpful to consider project needs and what's going to be appropriate and what you're engaging with, as well as making sure the stuff is credible and being able to ask those kinds of fact-checking questions too. So I kind of see those things connected and sort of like to talk about them together with students. So hopefully that can be a framing that maybe you find interesting as well. But let's now get into credible sources and different fact-checking techniques that you could be practicing and sharing. So I wanted to define credibility really quick. So essentially, credible sources are ones that are factual, accurate, and trustworthy. So they could be produced by individuals who have knowledge or expertise sort of on a topic. So when we're referring to that, that term will keep coming up. That's just a working definition I've used before. Something non-credible would obviously be not factual, inaccurate, not trustworthy. Maybe the person who produced it has no credentials or knowledge on the topic. So that flip side there. So there's a couple of different, factors that can go into whether a source is factual and accurate. Obviously, getting back to who produced it, does this person know what they're talking about? Do they have expertise on the topic? Are they able to talk about it appropriately? The kind of source you're looking at, when it was produced and if it's actually still relevant information. Things can often shift and evolve rapidly, especially around, say, like health topics and things like that. So stuff can get kind of out of date quickly. And so even just having that awareness or asking that question. Why a source might have been produced. Is it trying to sell you something? Is it trying to persuade you? Is it sharing facts with you? And where did this come from? And if this is sounding familiar, if you're familiar with something called the CRAP test, which is a delightful acronym, that is because this is definitely connected to that. There's certainly, I think, again, key questions you can ask for a lot of different things you encounter. But having that awareness, again, of a situation you might be in, yourself as a fact checker, the need you have for your project, I think can also be important to ask and consider alongside these questions. All right, so let's delve further into this. So when you're fact checking a source, I think, again, you can consider if whatever you're finding is even appropriate for your information need or necessary. Sometimes it just might not be the best fit, and you could discard that and move on and maybe spend your energy checking something else. Also, of course, considering if something is factual and credible and making sure you're not getting misled by bogus information or inadvertently using something that, is not correct for, say, an assignment or an activity. And then also considering if, as we mentioned, if this is a situation where you need a little more in-depth fact checking, maybe you need to spend some more time. So the factualness and credibility, the appropriateness of the source, and the overall kind of situation can all kind of come together here when you're practicing or considering fact-checking skills. So let's look at some situations where you might need to do more in-depth fact-checking and sort of talk through that together. So a couple ones that came to mind for me, and I'd love to hear if any have come up for you as well as you're thinking about this, but one is sort of a breaking news situation. So this could be where a topic is still developing and there's perhaps not a lot of settled consensus. It's still happening in real time. The scholarship hasn't been produced yet because it's still sort of ongoing. Those kinds of situations can be really important just to recognize that this is rapidly moving, stuff's changing. Maybe just to take a pause and make sure like you're not getting sucked into like a rumor or something like that, because again, it can be very easy to do. There's just a lot of churn out there. Also, if it is sort of breaking news situation, you might be getting information in a space that is, say, a social media site or a 24-hour news outlet or something like that. So you're having to also contend with that information overload with all the information out there, which again can just make it tricky to sift through things. So that's one situation that I've, flagged with students before, saying like, take a pause, make sure you're not jumping to conclusions. Maybe don't share anything immediately until it's been sort of checked, or you do some checking as well. Another one here is, of course, again, those contentious topics. So things that have been heavily contested, or they're debated, or there's lots of different opinions. It can be really polarizing. That's a space where if you are looking for information on something that kind of fits that parameter, or maybe you're researching a topic like that, it's good just to recognize so that you know, like, okay, I probably really do need to spend a little extra time getting up to speed on the debates, checking on who's saying what, being a little more cautious with where you find your sources and how you select them. Related to that is an unfamiliar topic, which I highlighted earlier, saying about how, we as fact checkers might have biases or we have knowledge areas and areas of expertise. For something unfamiliar, that can also be a space to, whether you're encouraging students or practicing this yourself, to take a little extra time to research, look into who is responsible for the source, or see what other people are saying, or double check on, where exactly did this come from? Am I seeing this on like a TikTok video, or is this an article in a newspaper? Doing things like that, I think, can be important, because unfamiliar topics, it can, again, be easy for any of us to maybe get misled or think something sounds great or looks good, and you kind of go off on a path like that. Sort of related to that is what I'm terming kind of unfamiliar sources. So maybe you're coming across something where you're really not familiar with the publication at all, or you've never heard of this author before, or it could even just be a type of media that maybe you don't consume very often, like a, say, short form video or something like that. If you don't know much about the source and how it's produced or who did the producing, that can also be a good sign, just to say, all right, let me do a little more digging. Let me run some extra searches here and take a little extra time. Just again, so you don't get, say, misled or end up maybe selecting a source from a really inappropriate outlet to use. And finally, any kind of high stakes project, and this is something I talk about with students a lot, whether it's, a really critical decision, like, I think I mentioned before, like a really major purchase you're going to do, or a big research assignment. You don't want to just sort of select any old thing, or perhaps just, run, say, a Google search and just take the first thing that appears, because, maybe there's something at stake here. You're about to spend a lot of money, or there's a huge part of your grade. So just being aware that, all right, this is a situation where I should probably ask some more questions. Let me do a little digging and due diligence and not just sort of rush through this. Okay. So, in terms of different strategies you can employ, so I mentioned some questions earlier about factors that could go into credibility, whether it's the purpose of a piece, who wrote it, where it's being shared, things like that, that a lot of you probably seen before on source evaluation list and different techniques. But there's a couple of other techniques that I did want to flag here that I think can be really important. And one of the major ones I like to talk about is known as lateral reading, which essentially is where, instead of reading something top to bottom like an article, you go sideways, you go lateral, and you open up tabs and just start seeing what other people are saying. So if I have an article in front of me and I don't know who the author is, I will Google that person's name and say, like, okay, who is this person? What's going on here? You see the outlet where it's being presented to you. You can check that out too. If someone's sharing it on social media, you can click on their profile and be like, do they have a history of sharing kind of questionable content? Do they seem like they follow conspiracy theories? Like, who is this person? Is the topic something really contentious? Just Google that and see what debates are coming up. An example I've used here with students before is goop.com, which is sort of the Gwyneth Paltrow health empire website. If you just get on the site or see their blog, it looks very fancy. It looks very nice and put together. You might think, yeah, this is pretty legit. This looks good. It's famous people, whatever. But if you Google just Goop, you start getting all these results for, like, scandals and a lawsuit and complaints to Netflix for airing their show and all this stuff. And just a quick Google search on just that publication or a topic can sometimes yield a lot of things where you can say, oh, okay, this seems controversial, or, oh, people are saying not great stuff about this. Let me take a pause here. Related to that is just sort of finding a variety of viewpoints or checking with a known or trusted source of information. So if it's something like, maybe you have a news outlet where you're like, they're consistently pretty solid with stuff, like, you've seen good factual stuff there before. Sometimes if you find something in maybe an unknown venue or arena, going to a space where, maybe an outlet or a journalist or a scholar who you're like, yep, they have solid stuff, they have a good track record. Let me see what they have to say about this. And if it seems to be on the same page or something's really different, that could maybe be a signal like, okay, let me look into this a little more. Maybe I don't want to use that source, or I don't want to believe that information. Another technique, especially with visual information, is something called reverse image searching. You can do this in Google Image, and I'd be happy to share some more information on this at the end if you're not familiar with it. But it's pretty basically, you can look up an image or a link for an image and see where it kind of originated, which can be helpful sometimes, especially since a lot of not even just fake images, but images can be shared from maybe it originated in one space and is actually about something else, but it's getting misattributed to another event. And that can be hard to detect on social media and something that can just be really challenging just for general consumers of information as well as researchers. So there's definitely techniques like that that you can deploy. There's also fact-checking websites and resources out there. Sometimes, especially for controversial issues, that can be just a space to go and see, like, did they pick this up? Or are people already flagging like something bogus is going on here, or rumors or things like that? I've had students, we've hopped on things like PolitiFact or Snopes or whatever. There's a whole variety out there, but you can often actually find your topic listed there. And they'll sort of maybe break down like, hey, these are common rumors we're seeing. Here's some examples. Then you can just be a little more on your guard as you're encountering information. Checking the sources as well. If there aren't any, that can obviously be a red flag that I know we talk about with students, or, if you're out there searching for stuff. But sometimes that can be good, just to see where did they get their information. Sometimes something can look very slick and well put together, but then you follow a link back and find, oh, that study doesn't actually say what they said it did, or this is completely unrelated to what they're talking about. And that can sometimes just be a flag, like, okay, there might be something going on with this. I should perhaps proceed with caution. Maybe I don't want to use that source. And also just asking for help as needed. I tell people this all the time. Not everyone can know everything. I have topics I'm not as familiar with. So whether it's, you're asking a colleague, or if you're a student here, asking a librarian or a professor, just to get some assistance. I've definitely gone to colleagues before who have expertise in areas I don't have, just so I can have a better sense of, I saw this thing, I'm a little confused. Is this a debate in your field? What's going on here? And just getting that information. So you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to feel isolated if you're looking through different sources and endeavoring to check them. All right. I also just wanted to flag, again, back to kind of that reflection on, maybe yourself as a fact checker. So I really emphasize this, aside from just asking questions, looking at, who produced this, those kind of standard things many of us talk about and I think are fantastic to do, is also just, again, coming back to, do you know a lot about this topic? Do you have strong feelings about it? Is this an issue where misinformation is pretty common and rampant? Maybe be a little more on your guard. Do you have a sense of the full conversation? Like, are there debates or sides on an issue? If you're just seeing kind of one thing getting kind of appearing over and over, or maybe see, is there stuff you could have been missed from a search strategy, or maybe you're just not coming across it? Or they're just, the red flags we often emphasize, like, are there no cited sources? Is the origin of this really unclear? Does this author seem to not have any real qualifications? That kind of reflection component, I think, can be so important and just help people avoid, snagging the first source they see and just using it for whatever, or making a decision based off of something kind of faulty, or just getting caught up in the moment. Maybe it's a distressing situation, or you see something where you're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. And you just want to share it. And it turns out later, that wasn't actually factual information. So having that reflection, because I think help people slow down, take a pause, and just make sure you understand what it is you're seeing and what it is you're trying to use. All right. There's fortunately a lot of places you can practice fact-checking skills. So there's an increased number of games out there, some of which we share, in the course, and we, share a lot of different resources you can check out. There's one called Bad News that's kind of fun. So if you're teaching these skills with others, I think sort of gamification can be a great way to help people practice. And we have some games in the campus course too that you can use as activities, but just things where you can add an element of fun to it and just help people, again, start developing those critical skills or getting the habit of asking certain questions or being able to recognize certain kinds of sources can be really fantastic. You can also see how different places like, say, fact-checking sites do their work, or there's many blogs from organizations like the NewsGuard is a place. I can put a link to them in the chat. They actually have a newsletter they send out where they step you through online rumors and how they go about fact-checking. So even seeing what experts do or just getting examples can be a great way just to learn more about what to look for, what to test out, etc. There's also just practice generally that I think us as individuals can do, even if it's, one time a day, you look at something that you found on social media and maybe just try out some lateral reading, do some Googling and see what it is, or practice a reverse image search, just so you can kind of build that skill. Can just take a few minutes and be fairly low stakes, but it could help you maybe know what to do or have those habits in place if you're in a situation that's more high stakes and you really want to make sure you're getting it right and you're finding credible and appropriate sources. And finally, there's increased number of AI tools coming out around fact checking. I think I'll just note that I think it's a good space to pay attention to and, test things as they come out. It's so new, it's sort of hard to know what's going to take off or what's going to be the best thing, but certainly happy to chat more about that if any of you have questions around AI. But I would just say, if you're interested in fact checking or want to keep practicing that skill set or teach it with others, it's, could be really interesting to see what's developing and, what seems to work well and what doesn't. But I would say use the same critical thinking skills you do with anything, including AI tools. So the same types of questions like, what exactly is this? What is it claiming to do? What experiences am I having? And don't just think, okay, well, this will magically be the shortcut. Maybe one day someone will develop a magical fact checking shortcut, but I don't think we're quite there yet, sadly. All right, so that was all the prepared content I have. I see we had some stuff coming in at the Q&A, and I know we had some other questions sent in earlier. So I'd love just to pause here and we can start going through our questions together, if that's okay. So yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really informative, and I think there were some really great tips there. So I think we're just going to address some of the
Yeah,
questions from the Q&A, and then we
okay,
also had
fabulous.
some questions that came up in the registration form. So
Perfect.
I'm just going to look here. So the first one is someone says there is also a problem of topics about which there is little scientific research, but lots of anecdotal information and common sense conclusions. It's
Mhm.
hard to sort through that then when trying to write an academic paper. So what are your tips for this?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for this question. I think I found an interesting article a couple years ago. If I have time, I'll try and dig it up. But they were talking about something known as data voids, which is basically where there isn't a lot of information, as you say, like there's not a lot published on it. Maybe there's more anecdotal things, etc. And it can be definitely really challenging for researchers. I think one thing is one for me, those kinds of situations, that can just be a good sign to do a little more careful checking with stuff, especially if it's sort of anecdotal information, sort of again asking, all right, where did this come from? Like, is there kind of even general consensus around some of those anecdotal things, et cetera, just to kind of ask those same questions again and just really kind of pay attention to what's out there. But I also think for researchers, not exactly the same as your scientific research example, but certainly something I've encountered since I do research around like misinformation and stuff. Um, it can be developing so quickly, and maybe there's not a lot of settled stuff out there, but to even highlight that itself when you're doing the research. So even just noting like there's sort of a lack of stuff out here about XYZ. Why might that be? And we're finding more stuff over here and almost kind of analyzing the situation itself can, I think, be helpful, especially if you're proceeding with sort of research around a topic like that that's perhaps not settled or really newly developing. So I would say, yeah, kind of even thinking through the situation itself, and again, just sort of deploying those additional sort of, taking a little more time with the fact checking, especially if you're not seeing a lot of scientific research coming out as of yet, can just, I think, help potentially arm a researcher with still appropriate sources and being able to talk about that kind of topic. a little more in depth, but happy to elaborate more, Dana, if you have anything else to add there. But yeah, thank you so much for that. That's a really good question and definitely a challenging situation for any kind of researcher, but especially a student researcher, I think. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There was a question from David as well. Do you have additional fake news simulation games that I could play with my college course students besides bad news? And I just wanted to highlight here as well that when we send the recording to all of you, we're also going to include lots of these resources. So there'll be lots of links to come as well. But I don't know, Sarah, if you have any others that you could bring up here.
Yeah, I think bad news is actually one of my favorites, but I believe the people who developed that, it was out of Cambridge, I think, and they had a couple of other sort of simulation games that they had come out with. But there was, oh goodness, there was one called like Break the Fake that I saw that came out in Canada. And there was another one that was around sort of it was specifically about health misinformation. And there was sort of again, kind of a simulation around that. So, but bad news definitely really, I think it kind of took off. I remember it was called Go Viral. And actually the World Health Organization supported it. And it was sort of specifically around kind of COVID mis and disinformation. But we can definitely share some additional links because yeah, I find the games pretty fun. My students really seem to get into them and they're just sort of laughing. Some of them actually encourage you to become an misinformation super spreader, but as a way to kind of educate you about the process, but they sort of have fun with it and then it can make for good discussion afterwards. So yeah, thank you for asking that. And yeah, we can certainly share some additional links and things. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that Dana has also shared one called
Yeah.
Pranky Uncle. I like that name.
Oh, that's funny. I love that. I'm gonna check that out. That is a new one to me. So fantastic. I love it.
So we also had a question about in the registration form from someone asking if what else is there beyond the crap test with that amazing name.
It's so funny. I know it's kind of tried and true. And I think I love it still. I think it can be a helpful way just to get people asking questions about, sources they're coming across, etc. There is an alternative one called the SIFT method that some of you might be familiar with. And again, we can share a link on that as well. But the researchers who did the SIFT method, I believe some of them are based at University of Washington, they also did work around lateral reading as well, which I talked about earlier. So that kind of going sideways when you're looking at stuff. And I think one thing the SIFT method can be helpful with is it sort of said it was a little more designed for kind of online fact checking as opposed to maybe working with like traditional kind of articles or other kinds of print sources. It kind of can work well with the online world. And really, again, just encourage that and kind of going laterally, checking on the situation, etc. So I know a lot of librarians who have embraced and use it. I think it can be a little more agile. So we'll definitely send a link out if you're interested in checking that. There's another one. I'm going to need to look at the exact name. I believe it was developed in Canada, but it was sort of another series of kind of more digital or media literacy questions that you could ask. But yeah, SIFT seems to be one of the major alternatives, at least with the CRAP tests that I've seen. And again, similar kinds of you're still asking critical questions about material, but you might be approaching how you, actually fact check or where you do it, et cetera, in other spaces. So yeah. Anyway, I think one of my biggest critiques with the CRAP method or CRAP test is it can be a little too kind of like checklist. And I think something I hope I tried to illustrate here is that, there can be different situations that maybe warrant other kinds of questions or lines of inquiry, or you might have a situation where, more fact checking is required or more investigation. And I don't, one size sort of fits all or like a checklist for everything for me can, sometimes maybe not be like the most appropriate approach, but I also know people who use it to great effect. So wherever you stand on it, just know there's alternatives out there and you can still do a lot with that particular test. Yeah.
Sounds good. There was a question on the chat, but also in the registration form related to AI and the use
Yeah.
of AI for fact checking. So could you
Yes.
expand a little bit more on that? I know you mentioned this during the
Yeah,
presentation, but if you could go into
absolutely.
a little bit more.
For sure. Yeah, we could have a whole session on just AI. So I mean, we could definitely do that. But one thing that I find a little ironic is sort of AI itself is, people are looking at how it's perhaps leading to more misinformation, but then people are also turning around and trying to do AI tools for fact checking. So it's both causing and solving its own problem, apparently. In terms of, I just want to touch briefly on sort of maybe concerns with it around it sort of causing things where you need to fact check more. If any of you have heard of AI hallucinations, some of you in libraries might have. In a nutshell, it's when you say you're using ChatGPT and it generates or provides a response to you, and either some component of that response or the whole thing is just made up. It's fabricated. We see it often with citations in particular. If you ask, say, like ChatGPT to provide sources, it might have real author, but a fake title they never wrote or something like that. And then you have students trying to like find the article and they can't find it anywhere. So I do think in terms of if you're teaching fact checking or evaluation, and as students and all of us are using AI tools more and more, emphasizing like, okay, that's a space where you're getting the information from matters, and you need to be sort of aware, like these are hiccups we've seen with these tools. You might want to really double check what it is that's been provided to you and make sure, that's actually real and you're not just writing a fake bibliography for your research paper because you got everything off of Gemini or what have you. In terms of new tools coming out, there's definitely some that are one's called Elicit. It's not fact checking per se, but it provides summaries of academic articles that maybe can be in a bit more, lay terms as opposed to an abstract or whatnot, that can be, an option for people trying to delve into topics and literature. Again, that's something you might want to double check and make sure that summary is accurate too. And some of the new tools coming out are purporting to be able to detect deep fakes and would be able to flag it, for example, or would be able to flag, suspicious content or a controversial topic online or things like that. So I think it's a really kind of new space right now. I have an article I can share after this that kind of highlighted a couple of the new tools coming out. But I would just say, if you have an interest in that or you're interested in AI and kind of what's going on, there's some great, outlets where they kind of write about these things regularly. A space I follow often is called Data in Society. It's spun off from Harvard University, and they often kind of just keep up with trends happening in that space. And just to see, who's developing what is it trying to do here? Some of it is a little more, like I said, focused on just images or just video, for example. But I imagine we'll see more and more things continuing to develop. So if you're teaching these types of topics, it could just be good to see what keeps bubbling up in the next couple of years, maybe test it with students. But as I said, also just use that critical thinking with the tools themselves and kind of see, like, let's double check the results, or let's see how this got developed and where it's coming from. So I'll say I haven't had as much experience yet with testing AI specifically for fact checking, but I think there's some ones coming out that will be interesting to start trying out or just see. And this was a long answer, sorry. My last thing I'll note is that some of them seem to be more aimed at journalists specifically. So I'm a little unclear if they're actually available for the full general public, or if it's more something that's going to be used by certain kinds of news outlets or things like that. But again, just an interesting space to keep an eye on. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. There was a question in the registration form about fact checking experts,
Yes.
because the person who asked the question says expert opinion is invaluable, but experts are human too. So what do you suggest there?
I really like that question. And yeah, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. I think, a lot of times students, and it can be easy to say, yep, it's a scholarly article, so you're good to go. You don't have to look any further. But for me, especially if you're teaching this with students, is to just encourage them to get in the habit of, you know, regardless of source, like just do at least a quick like lateral read, like Google search on the topic or what have you. It could be, you might not have to go say quite as in depth, like maybe you just say confirm it's scholarly, that this author has a good track record, that the consensus from experts on the article seems to track with what they were saying, things like that. But it definitely doesn't hurt to double check, because I mean, you can see examples from reputable news outlets kind of getting something wrong sometimes, or missing the mark with a breaking news situation, or a scholar kind of maybe having a very controversial take on an issue, and like it's good to be aware that, oh, that might be outside the norm, and like you can still engage with the ideas, but hey, let's double check there. So I just like this question. I think it can be helpful just to encourage healthy skepticism, regardless of source. Because one thing that can be a problem is if you get into a space where you're like, yep, I trust every single thing this particular source says, or this author can do no wrong, but we're all human and fallible. And so just making sure you at least do some quick checking and make sure, yep, we seem good to go here, I think can be just a good thing to emphasize and both practice ourselves and instill in others as well. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very good point. I think we have time for one more question, and then
yeah, for sure.
unfortunately we're going to have to
Okay.
end. But there was a question in the chat about reverse imaging. If you could talk a little bit
Yeah,
more about it, because you mentioned it, but they want a little bit more on it.
absolutely. Yeah. So that kind of or search you can run, and I'll see if I can get this into the actual chat so I can just give you a link with it. So Google has directions on Google Source on exactly how to go about doing this on whether a browser or a phone, but I think it can be a fun activity with students and a fun thing to practice. So let me see if I can't get this actually in chat, I'll just send it out to you. I think I can do this to maybe not to everyone. That's okay. We'll send it. But at any rate, they have sort of breakdown directions. And what's essentially happening is you're either loading an image file itself, or you provide a link to an image and then do the search. And what it'll do is flag sort of where it first originated or where it came from originally. And the reason this can be helpful is that a lot of times, as I mentioned, images can get sort of misattributed to things. There's an example I've used, and this was both a fake image and got attributed all the time. It's this during a hurricane, there was a picture of a shark swimming up a highway, and it said, oh, the flooding's so bad, the shark swam up a highway, and it was like, oh, wow. But it's appeared at like 5 different hurricanes over the years. Like every time there's a hurricane, the stupid shark would like come back again. And now it's been flagged more by fact checkers, and they're like, this is fake, this is stupid. But if you ran that through, you're getting hits of both the fact checking articles on it and the original like post when it very first emerged at this hurricane in 2017. So basically it can let you go back and make sure, like, where did this first come from? What year did it appear? Sometimes that can help if someone's saying this happened a week ago and you're like, that happened 10 years ago in another city. Like that isn't correct. So yeah, that's essentially what it's doing, is just flagging where it came from originally, and it'll give you other results that include that image. So if it was fact checked or people were picking it up as like, this is bogus, this is fake, you'll get those hits as well. So it can be a great strategy and technique. And yeah, something I think that makes a really good activity for students just to try out. So we'll share a link to some directions if you want to try it yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're going to send you all the links that we mentioned here. So let me just get my slides up just for the final, just the final part of the session. And you tell me if you can see, can you
Yes,
see the
that looks good.
slides?
Yep.
Oh, good. So I just wanted to highlight that Sarah here has developed a fact-checking course for Sage Campus. This is available now, and it explores a lot of the topics that we discussed today and more. So I would definitely encourage everyone to go and check it out. And how can you check it out? So If your university already subscribes to Sage Campus, you can get access to it straight away. So you just need to go on the platform and look for it there. If you're a librarian and would like to trial Campus for your institution, we have a trial form, which I'll include in the email after with the recording. And if you're a student or faculty member and would like to check it out individually, we also offer a seven-day trial, which I'll include the link to in the email. So we hope you learned some useful tips to make sure you're getting what you need and learning more about the origin and sources of your sources. And we hope to see you in a future webinar. So thank you very much, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
So thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.